It was supposed to be a simple drive home. Marcus Johnson had just finished up at the community center, where he spent most of his free time helping kids with their homework. He loved that place. It made him feel like he was doing something good, something that mattered. At 17, Marcus had big dreams. He wanted to go to college, become an engineer, and someday give back to his neighborhood in an even bigger way. But life had a way of throwing curveballs, and today, one was heading straight for him. Marcus drove his old, beat-up car down the quiet streets of his neighborhood. The car wasn't much, it had dents and scratches, and the radio barely worked, but it was his. He had saved up every penny from odd jobs to buy it, and he loved it because it meant freedom. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the city. Marcus rolled down his window to feel the cool breeze on his face. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel to the rhythm of the song in his head, thinking about the leftovers his mom had promised would be waiting for him at home. Everything felt calm, peaceful. But that peace didn't last long. Out of nowhere, Marcus noticed the red and blue lights flashing in his rearview mirror. His heart sank. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't run a stop sign. He wasn't sure why the police car was behind him, but he knew one thing: this wasn't good. He pulled over to the side of the road, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. His chest felt heavy, like someone had placed a giant rock on it. He could feel his pulse quickening, each beat echoing in his ears. The police officer stepped out of his car and started walking toward Marcus. He was a tall man with sharp eyes and a face that didn't show much kindness. As he got closer, Marcus could see the way the man looked at him. It wasn't a look of concern or even curiosity. It was a look that said, "You don't belong here." Marcus tried to stay calm. He knew the rules his parents had drilled into him since he was little: keep your hands where they can see them. Speak politely. Don't make sudden moves. Step out of the car, the officer barked, his voice loud and harsh. Marcus hesitated. He wasn't sure why he was being pulled over, and stepping out of the car felt scary. But he knew better than to argue. His mom always said, "Just do what they say and come home safe." So, with trembling hands, he reached for the door handle and slowly stepped out. As Marcus stood by his car, the officer's eyes swept over him. They didn't look kind. They looked cold, like the man had already made up his mind about who Marcus was. "What are you doing driving around here?" the officer asked, his tone sharp. "Just heading home," Marcus replied, keeping his voice steady even though he was shaking inside. The officer's lips curled into a smirk. "In this car? Doesn't look like it belongs to you." Marcus clenched his jaw. He wanted to say something, wanted to explain that he had worked so hard to buy this car, that it was his pride and joy, but he stayed quiet. He had learned that sometimes, silence was the safest choice. The officer looked him up and down, then leaned closer, his voice low but biting. "What's in the car? Drugs? Stolen stuff? You know, people like you always think you can get away with things." Marcus felt his stomach twist. People like you. He knew exactly what the officer meant. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at him like he didn't belong, like he was a problem just waiting to happen. "I don't have anything like that," Marcus said softly. The officer didn't seem to care. He motioned for Marcus to stand by the curb while he searched the car. Marcus watched as the man threw open the car door, tossing things around carelessly. His backpack, which held his school books and a half-eaten sandwich, was dumped onto the ground like it didn't matter. People started to gather nearby, watching from a distance. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, but no one said a word. They just stared, some with curiosity, some with pity, and some with fear. Marcus stood there, his hands at his sides, his heart pounding. He felt small, like the whole world was pressing down on him. But even in that moment, something inside him refused to break. He looked at the officer, who was now rummaging through the glove compartment. The man's actions were loud and aggressive, like he was trying to prove something. But Marcus wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of looking scared. A quiet fire burned in Marcus's eyes, one that said, "You can treat me like this now, but you won't win." Finally, the officer stepped back from the car, a look of frustration on his face. He hadn't found anything because there was nothing to find. "This is a warning," the officer said, tossing Marcus's license back at him. His voice was full of authority, but it also carried a hint of annoyance, like he was upset that his assumptions had been wrong. "Don't let me see you around here again," he added, turning back toward his patrol car. Marcus didn't say a word. He just watched as the officer got into his car and drove away, the red and blue lights fading into the distance. For a moment, Marcus stood there, staring at his car and the mess the officer had left behind. His backpack was on the ground, his papers scattered. He bent down to pick them up, his hands still shaking. But as he put the papers back into his bag, a new thought began to form in his mind. He reached into his pocket and felt his phone. It had been recording the whole time. Marcus looked around at the people who were still standing nearby, their faces a mix of worry and curiosity. Then he looked at his car, his hands tightening around his backpack straps. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The officer's tone was sharp, like a cold wind cutting through the air. His words carried no kindness, only suspicion and disdain. "What are you doing in a car like this?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he looked Marcus up and down. "Doesn't look like it belongs to you." Marcus clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. His lips stayed tightly closed, even though the words he wanted to say were swirling in his mind. He knew better than to speak. He knew better than to argue. Instead, he stood still, his hands at his sides, gripping the fabric of his jeans to stop them from trembling. The officer stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel on the side of the road. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue," he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Marcus didn't respond. He had learned long ago that speaking up could make things worse, and he couldn't afford to let this go sideways. The officer leaned down to peer into Marcus's car. "Let's see what you're hiding," he said, a smirk curling across his face. Without asking, he threw open the door and started rummaging through the car. Marcus watched helplessly as the officer yanked his backpack from the passenger seat. He unzipped it roughly, spilling the contents onto the ground. Books, notebooks, and a half-eaten peanut butter sandwich tumbled out onto the dirt. "Hey!" Marcus started, the word escaping before he could stop it. The officer shot him a look that made him freeze. "You got something to say, kid?" His voice was hard, daring Marcus to talk back. Marcus bit his lip and shook his head, his heart pounding. He wanted to tell the man to stop, to treat his things with respect, but he knew it wouldn't help. His mom's voice echoed in his mind, "Stay calm, Marcus. Always stay calm." The officer kicked at the spilled items with his boot, his smirk widening. He picked up one of Marcus's books and flipped through it carelessly before tossing it onto the ground. "What's this?" "Homework," he mocked. "Didn't think you'd be the type to care about school." Marcus felt heat rising in his chest, anger and embarrassment mixing together. Around him, a few people had started to gather. They stood at a distance, whispering to one another, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. None of them stepped forward. No one said a word. They just watched. The officer's voice broke through the murmurs of the onlookers. "Don't you people ever learn," he muttered, his tone low but loud enough for Marcus to hear. The words hit Marcus like a punch to the stomach. "You people." He knew exactly what the officer meant. Marcus stared at the ground, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He wanted to shout, to demand respect, to ask why the officer thought it was okay to treat him like this. But he didn't. Instead, he took a deep breath and stayed quiet. The officer moved back to the car, rifling through the glove compartment now. His movements were rough and careless, like he was searching for anything that could justify his actions. But there was nothing to find. Figures, the officer muttered as he slammed the glove compartment shut. He turned to Marcus, his expression hard. "You got lucky this time, kid." Marcus wanted to laugh. Lucky? How was this lucky? His things were scattered on the ground, his dignity trampled under the officer's boots, and he was supposed to feel lucky? But he kept his mouth shut, his face calm, even though his insides were burning. The officer stood there for a moment, as if waiting for Marcus to speak or react. When Marcus didn't, the man finally tossed his license back at him. "This is a warning," he said, his voice stern. "Don't let me catch you around here again." Marcus caught the license and slid it into his pocket. He didn't look at the officer, didn't say thank you, didn't say anything at all. Instead, he bent down and started gathering his things. He picked up his notebooks, brushing off the dirt, and carefully placed them back into his backpack. The officer watched him for a moment longer, then turned and walked back to his patrol car. Marcus could hear the crunch of the gravel under his boots, the sound growing fainter as the man moved away. He heard the slam of the car door, the rev of the engine, and then the patrol car was gone, its red and blue lights fading into the distance. Marcus let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he zipped up his backpack. The onlookers were still there, their whispers growing louder now that the officer was gone. He could feel their eyes on him, could feel their pity and curiosity pressing down on him like a heavy weight. He straightened up, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. His chest felt tight, his throat dry, but he forced himself to take slow, steady breaths. He wasn't going to let them see how much this had shaken him. As he turned to get back into his car, Marcus noticed one of the onlookers, a woman with kind eyes, take a step forward. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, but then she stopped. Instead, she just gave him a small nod, her expression sad but understanding. Marcus nodded back, a silent thank you, before climbing into his car. He sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His mind was racing, replaying the officer's words over and over. "Don't you people ever learn?" The phrase echoed in his head, each word stinging like a fresh wound. But as he sat there, staring at the road ahead, something shifted inside him. The anger and humiliation he felt began to transform into something else. Determination. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He had recorded the entire encounter. Every word, every action, it was all there. He stared at the screen, his finger hovering over the play button. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The officer finally stopped rummaging through Marcus's car, his face twisted in frustration. He had tossed through everything: Marcus's school books, his old sneakers, and even his half-eaten sandwich, but found nothing. No stolen goods, no hidden evidence, nothing to prove his suspicions. But that didn't seem to matter to the officer. He looked at Marcus with a smirk, as if he had still won somehow. "This is a warning," he said, his voice cold and sharp. He shoved Marcus's license back at him like it was garbage. "Don't let me see you around here again." Marcus caught the license, his hand shaking slightly. He wanted to ask, "What do you mean, around here? I live here. This is my home." But the words stayed trapped in his throat. The officer turned and strutted back to his patrol car, his boots crunching against the gravel. Marcus stood there by his own car, his backpack hanging off one shoulder, and watched him go. The red and blue lights on the patrol car blinked one last time before it sped away, leaving nothing but the faint smell of exhaust behind. Marcus's chest felt heavy. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him. He had lost count of the times people had looked at him like he didn't belong, like he was trouble just because of the color of his skin or the way he dressed. But that didn't make it any easier. Each time still hurt, like a fresh cut that hadn't had time to heal. For a moment, Marcus stood there in silence. He looked around. The people who had been watching were starting to move on, going back to their own lives. Some gave him small, apologetic looks, but no one said a word to him. No one asked if he was okay. He bent down to pick up the books and papers that the officer had carelessly tossed onto the ground. His fingers brushed against the dirt as he gathered them, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't rush. He didn't let himself cry, even though he wanted to. But as he straightened up and slid the last book into his backpack, a thought sparked in his mind. It was small at first, like the flicker of a match. But the longer he stood there, staring at the road where the officer had disappeared, the brighter that spark grew. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he unlocked it. The recording app was still open, the timer stopped at just over 5 minutes. He had recorded everything: the officer's sneering voice, the insults, the accusations, the rough way he had handled Marcus's things. Marcus stared at the screen, his thumb brushing against the play button. He could hear his own voice in his head, shaky but calm, answering the officer's questions. He could hear the officer's tone, full of contempt, as he said things like, "People like you." Marcus clenched his jaw. This time, he wasn't going to walk away quietly. He slid into the driver's seat of his car, his phone still in his hand. He sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel with one hand while the other hovered over the phone. The humiliation and anger he felt began to mix with something else: determination. Marcus opened his text messages and scrolled to a contact labeled Uncle James. His uncle was a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. He was one of the best in the city, known for taking on cases where people had been treated unfairly. Marcus typed out a quick message. "Uncle James, I need your help. I recorded something. Can I show it to you?" He attached the audio file and hit send before he could second guess himself. A few seconds later, his phone buzzed. It was a reply from his uncle. "Of course, Marcus. Come over tonight. I'll take a look." Marcus felt a small wave of relief wash over him. He wasn't alone in this. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard. It was getting late, but he didn't care. He started the car, the engine humming softly, and pulled back onto the road. His mind was racing as he thought about what his uncle might say, about what could happen next. As he drove, Marcus began to notice the little details he had missed before: the way the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving streaks of pink and orange in the sky. The street lights were just starting to flicker on, casting long shadows on the pavement. It felt like the whole world was shifting, like something important was about to happen. When Marcus arrived at his uncle's house, he parked his car in the driveway and took a deep breath. The familiar smell of his uncle's barbecue drifted through the air, reminding Marcus of better times: family gatherings, laughter, and stories shared around the table. He knocked on the door, and his uncle opened it almost immediately. James was a tall man with a strong presence, the kind of person who made you feel safe just by standing next to him. "Come in," James said, his voice warm but serious. Marcus stepped inside, clutching his phone tightly. They sat down at the kitchen table, and Marcus played the recording. As the officer's voice filled the room, Marcus watched his uncle's expression. James's face grew tight, his jaw clenching as he listened. When the recording ended, James sat back in his chair and let out a deep breath. "Marcus," he said, "this isn't okay. What that officer did, it's wrong. And we're not going to let him get away with it." Marcus felt his chest tighten, but this time it wasn't from fear or humiliation. It was from hope. "What do we do?" Marcus asked, his voice steady. James smiled, a small but determined smile. "We fight back," he said. "Legally, of course. But trust me, Marcus, we're going to make sure your voice is heard." For the first time that evening, Marcus felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He didn't know exactly what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to stay silent. This time, things were going to change. 15 minutes after getting home, Marcus sat at the small desk in his bedroom. His heart was pounding, but he wasn't scared anymore. He was determined. He had never done anything like this before, but he knew it was the right thing to do. His fingers moved quickly on the keyboard as he uploaded the video he had recorded earlier. The video showed everything: the officer's harsh words, the way he treated Marcus, and his cold, cruel smirk. It captured the moment when the officer said, "People like you," and when he kicked Marcus's things onto the ground without a second thought. Marcus made sure the title was bold and clear: "Racist Officer Exposed." As he clicked upload, a mix of emotions ran through him. He felt nervous, yes, but he also felt powerful. This time, he wasn't going to let the officer get away with it. The first comment came in less than 5 minutes. "This is so wrong. How can anyone treat a kid like this?" Then another. "Thank you for sharing this. We need to stand up against people like that, officer." The comments kept coming, faster and faster. Within an hour, the video had thousands of views. People were sharing it on social media, tagging their friends, and adding their own thoughts. Marcus refreshed the page over and over, watching the numbers climb. 50,000 views. 100,000 views. By the time he went to bed that night, the video had been watched more than 500,000 times. The next morning, Marcus's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Notifications flooded his screen: texts, calls, emails, and social media alerts. His classmates were sharing the video, and people from all over the country were commenting on it. "You're so brave, Marcus. Thank you for speaking up. We're with you." Marcus felt overwhelmed, but in a good way. People were listening. People cared. Later that day, Marcus's uncle, James, called him. "Marcus, I saw the video," James said, his voice calm but serious. Marcus hesitated. "Am I in trouble?" he asked. "No, not at all," James replied firmly. "In fact, I think this is something we can take further. I'm coming over tonight. We need to talk." That evening, Marcus and his uncle sat at the kitchen table. James, a well-known civil rights lawyer, had a folder of papers in front of him. He explained to Marcus how important the video was and how it could be used to hold the officer accountable. "This isn't just about you, Marcus," James said. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. That officer thought he could treat you like that because no one would care. Well, he was wrong." Over the next few days, things happened quickly. News reporters reached out to Marcus, asking for interviews. Local community leaders started organizing protests. Marcus even received a call from a famous activist who wanted to help. By the end of the week, the story was everywhere. The officer's name was on every news channel and website. People were talking about him, about the way he had treated Marcus, and about how wrong it was. Outside the police station, a crowd had gathered. People held signs that said things like, "Justice for Marcus" and "End Racism Now." They chanted together, their voices loud and strong. The officer, who had once been smug and untouchable, was no longer walking around with his head held high. Instead, he was under investigation. He had been suspended from the force, and there were calls for him to be fired. Marcus watched the news from his living room, his mom sitting beside him. She placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "I'm proud of you, Marcus. You did the right thing." But the story didn't end there. In the following weeks, People started having bigger conversations about racism and accountability. Local leaders promised to make changes to the police department. Schools invited speakers to talk about fairness and respect. And Marcus's community came together in a way it never had before. Marcus himself became a symbol of courage. People looked up to him, not because he was trying to be a hero, but because he had shown what could happen when someone refused to stay silent. One evening, Marcus sat on his bed, scrolling through his messages. Among the hundreds of supportive comments, one stood out. It was from a kid his age, who wrote, "Thank you, Marcus. I went through something similar, but I was too scared to do anything. You've inspired me to speak up." Marcus smiled. For the first time in a long time, he felt like things were changing not just for him, but for others too. Looking back, Marcus realized how important that one moment had been. The moment he decided to pull out his phone and hit record. The moment he decided not to let fear control him. And now, as he looked at the screen in front of him, filled with messages of hope and support, he knew that his actions had made a difference. Sometimes, Marcus thought, standing up for yourself means standing up for others too. And that's a lesson he would never forget. The officer was forced to face the music. People from all over had seen the video Marcus uploaded. It showed the truth, plain and simple. The officer's cruel words, his smug attitude, and his unfair treatment of Marcus couldn't be ignored anymore. The police department, feeling the heat from the protests and public outcry, held a press conference. The chief of police stood in front of a group of reporters, looking serious and uncomfortable. Beside him was the officer. His face was pale, and his shoulders were slumped. The chief cleared his throat and began, "We do not condone the behavior shown in the video. This officer's actions do not represent the values of our department or this community." Then, he turned to the officer, who stepped up to the microphone. His voice was shaky, and his words felt empty. "I want to apologize to Marcus Johnson and his family," he said. "I made a mistake, and I regret my actions." But Marcus wasn't watching the apology. He knew it didn't come from the officer's heart. It came because he had been caught. While the officer's apology aired on TV, Marcus was busy doing something much more important. He was sitting in his living room, surrounded by community leaders, teachers, and even a few local politicians. They had come to talk about what could be done to make things better not just for Marcus, but for everyone. Marcus's mom brought out a tray of snacks and set it on the coffee table. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered to Marcus before stepping out of the room to give them privacy. One of the community leaders, Ms. Carter, looked at Marcus with a kind smile. "You've started something powerful here, Marcus," she said. "People are listening. Now we need to make sure this leads to real change." They talked for hours, sharing ideas and planning next steps. They wanted more training for police officers, programs to teach kids about their rights, and better ways for the community to report unfair treatment. Marcus listened carefully, nodding along. When it was his turn to speak, he said, "I don't want anyone else to feel the way I did that day. It wasn't just about me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Everyone in the room nodded in agreement. A few weeks later, Marcus was invited to speak at a local school assembly. The auditorium was packed with students, teachers, and parents. Marcus stood nervously behind the podium, looking out at the crowd. He took a deep breath and began, "When I first recorded that video, I didn't think it would become this big. I just wanted to stand up for myself. But now, I see that it's not just about me. It's about all of us. We all deserve to be treated with respect, no matter who we are." The room was silent as everyone listened. Marcus shared what had happened to him, how it had made him feel, and what he hoped would change. By the end of his speech, people were clapping and cheering. Some even wiped away tears. Marcus's words were simple, but they came from the heart. And they inspired everyone who heard them. Meanwhile, the officer's life had taken a very different turn. After the public apology, things only got worse for him. The police department launched a full investigation into his behavior, not just with Marcus but with others as well. More people came forward, sharing their own stories of how the officer had treated them unfairly. It became clear that this wasn't the first time he had abused his power. Within a month, the officer was fired. The department released a statement saying they were committed to rebuilding trust with the community. The officer's name was all over the news, but not in a good way. His reputation was ruined, and he had no one to blame but himself. Marcus, on the other hand, became a symbol of hope and resilience. People in his neighborhood looked up to him. Kids at his school started talking about standing up for what's right. Even adults said they were inspired by his bravery. The local news interviewed Marcus one afternoon. He sat in the studio, feeling a little nervous but ready to share his story. The reporter smiled at him and asked, "Marcus, what do you want people to take away from what happened to you?" Marcus thought for a moment before answering, "I want people to know that they have a voice. Even if you feel small or scared, your voice matters. And when we stand together, we can make a difference." The interview aired that evening, and thousands of people watched it. Marcus's words struck a chord with viewers, and the video was shared widely online. Over time, Marcus's story led to real change. The police department announced new training programs to teach officers how to treat people fairly and with respect. Schools started holding workshops on equality and kindness. And Marcus continued to speak out, sharing his story whenever he could. One day, Marcus received a letter in the mail. It was from a boy in another state who had seen his video. "Dear Marcus," the letter began, "I saw your story, and it gave me courage. Something similar happened to me, and I didn't know what to do. But now, I feel like I can stand up for myself. Thank you for being brave." Marcus smiled as he read the letter. It reminded him why he had taken that first step to record the video. Looking back, Marcus realized how much had changed because of one small decision. By refusing to stay silent, he had sparked something much bigger than himself. And even though the officer's actions had hurt him deeply, Marcus knew he had turned that pain into something meaningful. In the end, justice had been served. But more importantly, Marcus had shown the world what could happen when one person stood up and said, "This is not okay." Sometimes, the smallest actions can make the biggest difference. That's what Marcus learned. When he pressed record on his phone that day, he didn't know how much would change. He just knew he couldn't let what happened go unseen. It wasn't just about him, it was about something bigger. At first, Marcus had felt small and powerless. Standing by his car while the officer sneered at him, throwing his things on the ground, Marcus had felt like he didn't matter. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He mattered. Everyone mattered. And someone needed to remind the world of that. Marcus thought a lot about what it means to be brave. He used to think bravery meant fighting back or shouting louder than everyone else. But now he knew the truth. Bravery could also mean staying calm when you're angry, standing tall when you feel small, and speaking up even when your voice shakes. That day, Marcus didn't yell at the officer. He didn't argue or fight. But he did something just as powerful. He chose to act. He pressed record. He made sure the truth was captured. And because of that one small action, so many things changed. After everything happened, Marcus spent a lot of time talking to people in his community. Kids, adults, teachers, and even local leaders came to him, asking about his story and how he had stayed so strong. "Weren't you scared?" a little girl asked him one day at a community event. Marcus knelt down to her level and smiled. "I was scared," he admitted. "But being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It just means you do what's right, even when you're afraid." The girl nodded, her big eyes thoughtful. Marcus could see that his words mattered to her, and that made him feel proud. Marcus also received letters and messages from people all over the country. Some were from kids like him who had faced unfair treatment. Others were from adults who said they had never really thought about how these things happened. One message, in particular, stuck with Marcus. It was from an older man who wrote, "Marcus, I grew up in a time when things like this happened all the time, and nobody ever spoke up. Watching you take a stand gives me hope for the future. You're teaching all of us that it's never too late to fight for what's right." Reading those words, Marcus felt a lump in his throat. He had never imagined that his actions could inspire so many people. The protests and changes that followed his video were just the beginning. Marcus knew the fight for justice wouldn't end overnight. But he also knew that every step forward mattered. One evening, Marcus sat with his mom at the dinner table. She looked at him with tears in her eyes and said, "I'm so proud of you, Marcus. You've done more than I ever imagined." Marcus smiled at her, but then he said, "Mom, I couldn't have done it without you. You always taught me to stand up for myself and for others. That's what I was trying to do." His mom hugged him tightly, and for a moment, everything felt okay. Marcus often thought about the lessons he had learned. He realized that strength doesn't always look like muscles or loud voices. Sometimes, strength is quiet. It's in the patience to stay calm, the courage to take action, and the kindness to inspire others. He also learned the power of a single voice. When he had pressed record, he felt small and alone. But once the video was shared, he saw that he wasn't alone at all. There were so many people who cared, who wanted to help, and who believed in doing what was right. Sometimes, Marcus told a group of kids at his school, "You think your voice doesn't matter. But it does. Every voice matters. And when you use your voice, you can help others find theirs too." The kids nodded, their faces serious. Marcus could see that they were listening, and that made him feel like he was doing something good. One day, Marcus was walking home when he saw a group of younger boys playing basketball at the park. They waved him over and said, "Hey, Marcus. Can you teach us how to shoot like you?" Marcus laughed and joined them, showing them how to aim and follow through. As they played, one of the boys looked up at him and said, "We're glad you're in our neighborhood. You make us feel like we can do anything." Hearing those words made Marcus's heart swell. He didn't set out to be a role model, but if his actions could inspire others, he was happy to lead by example. Years later, when Marcus thought back on everything that had happened, he felt a deep sense of pride. He remembered how scared he had been that day, how angry and humiliated he had felt. But he also remembered how he had turned those feelings into action. He had learned that even in the face of injustice, there is power in standing up and saying, "This is not okay." Marcus often shared this message with others: never underestimate the power of a quiet fighter. Because when they rise, the whole world watches. And he believed those words with all his heart. Marcus's story wasn't just about a boy who pressed record on his phone. It was about showing the world that even the smallest actions can spark the biggest changes. It was a reminder that everyone has a voice, and when we use our voices together, we can create a better, kinder, and fairer world. And for that, he would always be proud.